Well, considering the United States alone, we report about 476,000 new cases of Lyme disease every year. And that's probably grossly underreported. So we don't really know what the true number is, but it could be anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million. And understand that's new cases, not people who have ongoing Lyme disease. And in that, the CDC says that, up to 80% of people get the bullseye rash. The research suggests it's somewhere between 30 and 40%.
Yeah.
And those of us in clinical practice will probably tell you it's less than 20%.
Dr. Darin Ingels is a licensed naturopathic doctor, author, international speaker, and leading authority on Lyme disease. His book, The Lyme Solution, a 5-part plan to fight the inflammatory autoimmune response and beat Lyme disease, is a bestseller. Additionally, Dr. Ingels is a former Lyme patient who overcame his own 3-year battle with Lyme disease after he was failed by conventional treatment and had become progressively debilitated. Dr. Ingels found that proper diet, lifestyle management, and natural therapies worked with his body to heal. He then applied what he learned about his own healing journey to his Lyme patients and found that they recovered faster and with less side effects. Dr. Ingels has now treated more than 8,000 Lyme patients using his novel approach, many who have gone on to have healthy lives and lived symptom-free. Dr. Ingels has been featured on WebMD, Mind Body Green, Be Well, Thrive Global, and many more. Welcome, Dr. Darin Ingels. Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Amy Myers with the Take Back Your Health podcast. Today, I have with me Dr. Darin Ingels, who is a Lyme expert and also a very dear friend. So I am so happy to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me, Amy.
So you and I met, it's now many years ago, at a autism conference. And, when I was working in my practice, it's very interesting. I, of course, saw many people with autoimmune diseases, and I myself had mercury overload. And so I kind of thought a lot of things were that. And then I met Dr. Ann Shippey, and I started realizing, oh no, a lot of things are also toxic mold. And then I met you, Darin, and it was like, oh, and there's a lot of things that are Lyme. So it's really, you were my absolute go-to person, both in my own clinic to help me whenever I had somebody with Lyme, and then I often would refer them to you. But it's kind of that interesting, what do you want to say, in practice where the things are what you know. And, until I knew you, I really didn't know anything about Lyme. And so I was, not looking for it because I didn't know how to treat it. And then I met you, thankfully, and you really helped me help my patients so much more. So can you start by kind of telling us a little bit about yourself and your story? I know you have a personal story with Lyme.
Sure. Well, I'm a naturopathic doctor by training. I've been practicing for almost 25 years now, and I lived in Connecticut for almost 20 years. And for people who don't know, Lyme disease is named after Lyme, Connecticut, which was about 30 minutes up the road from where I lived. And 2 weeks before I opened my own practice, I got Lyme disease. I had got bit by a tick, and I had all the classic symptoms. I had a big bullseye rash on my leg and 105 fever and joint pain and headaches and numbness and tingling. And so I was fortunate that I caught it right away, and I started treatment. And really within a handful of days, I felt perfectly fine. But, for anyone who's ever owned their own business knows what it's like when you get started. I couldn't afford staff, and I was doing everything. So, burning the midnight oil for, 7-8 months. I remember it was February of 2003, and I started getting symptoms again. And I said, oh, this is really familiar. But, I treated it before and was very successful. So I was like, let me just do the same thing again, which was doxycycline. And I tried it for a month and didn't get any better. Then I said, well, maybe we try a different antibiotic. We need something different now. Tried it for another month, azithromycin, didn't get any better. Then I started cycling through really 9 months of oral antibiotics.
Wow.
Not only not getting better, but getting worse. So I was fortunate to have known of a doctor in New York City named Dr. Zhang, Chinese medical doctor, acupuncturist, and herbalist. He started me on Chinese herbs. And it was also a little bit of the wake-up call, everything we tell our patients to do. You're not eating well, you're not sleeping well, you're not taking care of yourself. So it was a lot of those diet and lifestyle factors as well, plus the Chinese herbs. And within a month of that, I felt 85% better. it still took me another 2 years to get to a point where I really felt like I got my health back, but eventually got to a point where, I was symptom free.
Kind of in a way, you were really lucky. Most people, as you know better than me, really don't even realize they got bit by a tick, much less end up with the bullseye rash. I mean, you in a certain kind of way were lucky that those things happened to you. And then also, of course, being a naturopathic doctor and knowing exactly what to do versus many of, the people that come to us prior to getting to us have already been so many other places and dismissed, and it's not real. So, can you speak to that? Are there any statistics about the number of people who, really have no memory of being bit by a tick, do not have the bullseye rash versus those that do?
Well, considering the United States alone, we report about 476,000 new cases of Lyme disease every year. And that's probably grossly underreported. So we don't really know what the true number is, but it could be anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million. And understand that's new cases, not people who have ongoing Lyme disease. And in that, the CDC says that, up to 80% of people get the bullseye rash. The research suggests it's somewhere between 30 and 40%.
Yeah.
And those of us in clinical practice will probably tell you it's less than 20%. So that classic bullseye rash is certainly not the best marker on whether you've been exposed to Lyme disease. And, this is where we get into a lot of controversy with Lyme. The CDC, if you go to their website and read about Lyme disease, will tell you it's based on your signs and symptoms, and particularly if you live in an area that's endemic for deer ticks. And for people who don't know, Lyme disease is primarily transmitted through deer tick bites. And deer ticks, used to be kind of confined more to the Northeast, New England area and central Midwest. And what we're finding is now the eastern and western seaboards of the United States are covered in deer ticks, and birds are now carrying them inward. It's been reported in all 50 states. So it kind of doesn't matter where you are in the world. It's possible to have that exposure. And because the symptoms look like so many things, and we call Lyme disease the great imitator, the great mimic, it often gets misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. So people go to the doctor, they go to the specialist, they have all this tests done, imaging studies, and usually things come back looking pretty normal on paper. But they've got headaches and joint pain and fatigue and numbness and tingling and burning sensations and sort of kind of a weird collection of symptoms. So for me, when I hear that combination of neurological symptoms and arthritic symptoms, that's a big red flag that it could be Lyme disease or, one of these other tick-borne infections.
Well, so let's talk about that. Lyme, we're saying Lyme disease, but really it's a spectrum and a whole host of different infections. So can you kind of define that for us or speak to us about what really is Lyme disease?
Well, Lyme disease itself is a bacterial infection, and it's caused by an organism primarily called Borrelia burgdorferi, or Borrelia species. And there are different species of Borrelia depending on whether you're in North America, Asia, Europe, and so forth. But it's a spirochete, and spirochetes are specific kinds of bacteria that if you look at them under a microscope, they have this kind of corkscrew shape to them. And so much like a corkscrew, it has the ability to get into tissue, to get into cells more than other bacteria. And it's also a true shapeshifter. It also has the ability to ball itself up in this little, instead of this long uncoiled thing. If you're old enough to remember the slinky, you used to pull the slinky apart and it would come back together. Borrelia kind of does the same thing. So when it's in this elongated form, this corkscrew form, the immune system can kind of see it. When it slinkies back up and gets into this, what they call round body form, the immune system doesn't recognize it at all. So it can go into sort of this dormant phase of being quiet, and the immune system doesn't recognize it. And that's part of what leads to treatment failure is that, the best time to treat the organism is when it's in its elongated form and replicating. Another thing about Lyme that makes it a bit complicated is that it's an extremely slow growing organism. Most bacteria replicate every 10 to 20 minutes. So if you get strep throat, you can take a Z-Pak for a week and you're fine. Lyme replicates every 1 to 16 days. That is incredibly slow. So this idea that you can give 2 or 3 weeks of antibiotics and get rid of Lyme disease, where it may have only gone through one replication cycle during that time period, is a little bit insane. But when you look at the research too, on ticks that carry Lyme, particularly up in New England, we know that up to 33% of ticks that carry Lyme also carry something else. So when you get bit by a tick, the tick has in its saliva these different bugs, passes into your bloodstream. And there's things like Bartonella, which is a bacterial infection. There's something called Babesia, which is a blood parasite and kind of a cousin of malaria. There's Ehrlichia, there's Anaplasma, there's different viruses. Powassan virus has been one that's been coming up in the news in the last several years up in New England, which is lethal, and there's nothing they can do about it. So, every time I go to another Lyme conference, I swear there's another laundry list of organisms that we find, the ticks might carry. So as we're evaluating people for Lyme, we're really never just looking at Borrelia, because there's so much overlap in symptoms. We say we're looking at tick-borne illness. So we're testing for Borrelia, but we're often testing for a lot of these co-infections as well.
And that's exactly what I was going to say, because I saw so many people in my clinic that, I later referred to you that did have many of these. I mean, do you call this a secondary infection or just a co-infection?
Yeah, co-infection.
Co-infection. Okay.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about testing, because, someone like yourself who, got bit by a tick, had this bullseye rash, you probably could have walked into your conventional doctor and hopefully your Lyme blood test would have been positive, right? And even not, you had these symptoms, you would have been given antibiotics. Likely not for a long enough period of time, but someone would have believed this story. But so many of our patients don't have this story. And so when they go to their doctor, can you talk about sort of conventional testing and the pros and cons of that? And then maybe what you're currently using. I know that it's ever evolving, but what you're currently using in your practice to determine if someone has. And then also, there's active current Lyme, and then there's chronic Lyme, like what you experienced that resurfaced. So maybe speak to all of that if you could.
Conventional testing is what they call a two-tier testing. So you go in for a blood test, and every reference lab in the world does this. And the first test is a Lyme screen test. It looks at IgG and IgM antibodies. So IgM is the antibody we associate with usually acute infection. IgG would suggest that maybe it's a past infection. So they do the screening test. If that test is positive, it then flexes over to what's called a Western blot or an immunoblot, which is a much more detailed antibody test where it looks at a bunch of different antibodies associated with Lyme disease. Again, looking at IgG and IgM. And then if that test is positive, they say, okay, well, you have Lyme disease.
But that is really only checking for Lyme. It's not checking for any of these co-infections.
Only checking for Lyme, and it's only checking for Borrelia burgdorferi. So If you live in Europe, if you live in another part of the world where Borrelia burgdorferi is not the dominant strain, really looking at the wrong thing. And what's kind of crazy is that, people need to understand this test was never designed to be diagnostic. It was developed over 40 years ago as a surveillance tool. These are people that had classic Lyme disease. They had the bullseye rash and the headache and the fever and all the symptoms, and they wanted a way to monitor kind of their immune response. If you go to the CDC's website today, it will tell you the diagnosis of Lyme disease is clinical, which means it's based on your signs and symptoms, particularly if you live in an area endemic for deer ticks. So when you look at the research on the two-tier testing, it is a very insensitive test. The sensitivity to test means if you have the disease, what's the likelihood it's going to pick it up? And the research suggests, again, it's in the high 30% of sensitivity. I was a clinical microbiologist before I was a doctor. I used to do all these tests for a living. A good test should be at least 95, 96% sensitive. So at face value, Lyme testing is terrible. And it's, if you happen to get a hit, that's great. False negatives are extremely common. False positives are very uncommon. So if you get a positive test through any lab, the likelihood of it being a false positive is extremely low. But again, you have to take a look at what you see on paper versus what you see clinically. Because if I tested everybody in New England, I'd bet my life that we'd find maybe 70% of people have some antibodies against Lyme. They get the exposure, but their immune system's robust, their immune system's resilient, and they never get the clinical symptoms. So we can't just look at the piece of paper by itself and go, well, yeah, you have Lyme disease. But if we see evidence of that exposure and you have the clinical symptoms, we kind of put two and two together. So, there are labs that we use in our clinic that have more reliable testing. There's a lab out of Palo Alto, California called IGeneX, which is a very good, reliable lab. There's a lab out of New Jersey called Medical Diagnostic Labs. So between the two, we usually use one or the other, and that gives us better information about your exposure.
Why do you think that conventional medicine is not using these labs that you just mentioned?
It's a great question. I wish I had a good answer. I think a lot of it is ignorance. I also think a lot of it is, you and I have both been through the medical education system. It's one generation hands down that knowledge to the next generation. And if that information's wrong or ignorant, it just keeps passing down to the next generation of doctors until you start breaking the cycle and educate doctors in a different way. And, I go to an ILADS meeting. ILADS is the International Lyme and Associated Disease Society, which is really sort of the group that's opposite of the Infectious Disease Society of America, that doesn't believe in chronic Lyme disease, that thinks Lyme disease is very easily treated. And all these people out there who have Lyme symptoms that don't have a CDC positive Lyme test, they don't have Lyme disease. And we just know from the research that's not true. So, the ILADS group has taken a much broader understanding of Lyme disease and uses the actual CDC criteria of, clinical diagnosis, using labs as a way to measure, have you had exposure? And what's crazy, in 40 years of research, we know that some of the antibodies are very specific to Lyme. Some of them are not specific. So why we've never changed the criteria to say, hey, why don't we just look at the Lyme specific antibodies and not so much on the non-specific antibodies? That would probably get us better information. Why infectious disease doctors don't actually follow the CDC guidelines in diagnosis, I don't understand that at all. They tend to be the ones that are the most outspoken, and particularly for those people with chronic Lyme disease. So in their world, they say there's no such thing as chronic Lyme disease. They call it post-Lyme treatment syndrome, which means I know you still have symptoms, but it's not Lyme disease. Even though all your symptoms are consistent with Lyme disease, it's something else. Well, what is it? We don't know.
I can be cynical and say, I understand to some degree why a rheumatologist, if you're treating someone, with rheumatoid arthritis and you're giving them Humira, it's a very expensive drug. There are patents on these drugs. And the patient needs to continue to come back. So that supports the drug company, that supports the doctor. In a very cynical way, I can sort of understand why that doctor may not want to open their eyes to actually getting to the root and getting these patients off the drugs. But with Lyme disease, there isn't an expensive patentable drug to treat it. So it does kind of seem like ignorance at that point, right? It's a generic antibiotic, or of course you have other ways, diet and lifestyle, but they're not missing out on something. In fact, it relieves a headache for them because they get this patient out of their clinic that they have mysterious illnesses and they don't know what to do with if they could diagnose it.
Well, and I think the hard truth too is that they don't know what to do with these patients. If I've given you 3 or 4 weeks of antibiotics and you're not better, what next? Now, do I run the risk of giving you long-term antibiotics where I put you at the risk of yeast infections and C. diff infections? Or do I just kind of write off and go, well, I've given you the course of treatment, you didn't get better, it must be something else. So I think a lot of doctors, realize that if they're not kind of trained in our way, they don't have anything else in the toolbox to offer. And you know how it is. If you don't understand something, it's easier to dismiss it than to try and actually sit down and figure it out. So I kind of think that's where a lot of the infectious disease doctors are coming from. They just seem to write it off. And, there was a commission that was put together by the White House, maybe it was 2015, 2016, where they put a, tick-borne committee together. And I think maybe it was under the umbrella of the NIH as a way of, bringing hopefully researchers, doctors, patients together to find out, can we find better ways of diagnosing Lyme disease? Can we come up with better treatment protocols? And they stacked the deck with people who were very outspoken against chronic Lyme disease. I'm like, they went into this, committee meeting with, already people who don't believe Lyme disease even exists. So that kind of tells you, I guess, where the government stands on this, that they don't seem to be terribly interested in really understanding the nature of Lyme. Also understand, this is the fastest growing infectious disease in the United States and the world. You would think that somebody would be paying attention, yet there's hardly any money that goes into research in the US or anywhere else in the world. So, we're all kind of left out there on our own devices as clinicians to figure out, what works best for our patients.
When COVID came out and there were all of these people that now are being labeled as long COVID, I was really watching that to see, are they going to acknowledge this or not? And frankly, those of us that have been working with people with chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, chronic Lyme, all of these conditions that the conventional medical world has been poo-pooing for years, if not continuing to, I just found it interesting that they did actually wake up and acknowledge that there is something called long COVID.
I think every Lyme patient looked at long COVID and they're like, hello. I mean,
Yeah.
so you're saying
Right.
that you can have long-term consequences of having an infection. And it's not the direct infection itself necessarily that's causing the problem. It's, in the case of COVID, of course, we know that the spike protein persisted for much longer than people thought. And the nature of Lyme, it's kind of the same thing. And of course, if you look at the symptoms of long COVID, the symptoms of Lyme disease, there's a lot of overlap. There could be an argument made that, did COVID really become a catalyst for other underlying infections to become more dominant? Certainly people in my practice who've been suffering from chronic Lyme, if they got COVID, when they got COVID, their symptoms got dramatically worse. And we know from the research on COVID specifically, that it activates glial cells in the brain, in particular, the nervous system, that just sets off this cascade of inflammation. So people had more brain fog, more fatigue, more insomnia, more mood changes, more neurological symptoms. I'm like, right, it was just like throwing gas on fire. So now not only are we trying to manage, the Borrelia or the co-infection, now we've got to get into, dealing with spike protein, long COVID, and that whole protocol. And, fortunately, I think we've been able to pull most people out of the weeds with COVID, but it's just added another layer of complexity to people. We're such a sick society as a whole. I think that's why we saw so much COVID in the US more than other parts of the world. Metabolically, we're not a fit society. And we've shown in the research that definitely leads to bad outcomes from COVID. But for anyone who's dealing with autoimmune disease, chronic infection, COVID was definitely no bueno.
Absolutely. I mean, the number of, people that I've heard of either anecdotally or through colleagues and friends like yourself working with people who either got COVID or got vaccinated and then had an uptick in their autoimmune condition, resurgence of their Lyme. And, how do you parse that out of what actually is the COVID versus what is this underlying infection that just ramped up all those inflammatory cascades?
Well, I think at the end of the day, the approach isn't drastically different. I mean, I think it's still about the terrain, all the things you and I, do in our practices. We educate people about, it's about good gut health. It's about good immune health. It's about getting good sleep. It's about moving your body. It's about reducing your toxicity. I think fundamentally chronic illness has a lot of the same factors that drive illness. It may manifest in different ways. But, we still have to do all these other things to get people well, because if we superficially are just trying to deal with the infection, that's kind of the tip of the iceberg. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. So yes, we have to deal with that piece, but we also have to deal with, again, what were all these other factors that led to this infection being as prominent as it is. And again, we can look at any infection in the world. Why did some people with COVID get a sniffle and some people died? Why do some people with Lyme get no symptoms and other people are completely debilitated? Why do we get these huge variations? If we believe in germ theory, the germ should affect people relatively the same. And it doesn't. We see these very wide variations in how people respond to it. So again, I think that's where it comes back to the terrain and looking at good, metabolic health.
Let's talk about your practice. I mean, I think you've alluded to conventional medicine. It's several rounds of antibiotics. If that doesn't work, you're dismissed. Do you use antibiotics? Are you just using this Chinese herb? If you are not always using antibiotics, I guess, when do you decide that that's something that you need to use? And then what do you do to help protect the microbiome and the gut and everything as you're using the antibiotics or even the herbals, I guess, because that, of course, can affect the microbiome as well?
Well, I mean, I think antibiotics have its place. I mean, certainly with acute Lyme disease, that's very well indicated. And again, I've had patients that have responded quite well to antibiotics. And of course, insurance covers it. And in some cases, it can be relatively inexpensive. Unfortunately, that's a very, very small percentage of my practice. I rarely see somebody with acute Lyme disease. People who have true acute Lyme disease probably end up in their primary care doctor's office or maybe even the ER if they're that symptomatic. So most of the people I'm dealing with have had this for some time, and whether it's months or years, it varies a lot. So, again, when you look at the research on antibiotics, it's not very favorable. We know that Lyme disease, itself can damage your mitochondria. We know that a lot of antibiotics can damage your mitochondria. So I'm always hesitant about adding something that might undermine that part of the cell that you need to create energy and help with tissue repair. We know that antibiotics are going to have collateral damage on your microbiome, which is an important part of having a healthy immune system. So, I've treated thousands and thousands of Lyme patients over the years, and I've written maybe 10 prescriptions for antibiotics. So it's not a big part of my wheelhouse. But again, I'm a naturopathic doctor by training. Herbs are very much in our wheelhouse. And we found, again, through some of the research, that herbs work as well, and in some cases even better than antibiotics. And you don't get the same level of collateral damage to your gut. Again, I rarely get complaints of people having gastrointestinal problems. I don't have to worry about it damaging the mitochondria. And the nature of herbs too, because they have so many different constituents in plants, not only do they target the organism, a lot of them are anti-inflammatory. They help support your immune system. They help promote better blood flow. So we can really mix and match herbs for each individual person to find out what their body needs to kind of get them over that hump.
Anything in particular that you're doing, for the microbiome? Is it just a simple probiotic? Is it L-glutamine? What are you doing to support the person while they're taking these herbs?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first step is always looking at gut health for me. So often we are doing some element of stool testing to try and get a close look at the gut. If that's not possible, it's just through questionnaires and history. How well do you eliminate? How often do you go to the bathroom? Do you have normal looking stools? I find a lot of people, they've got long-standing gastrointestinal issues, whether it's constipation, diarrhea, gas, bloating, SIBO. So, we've got to address all those underlying gut issues first. Again, I like to test and not guess to be more specific, so we're not just throwing a bunch of things at people. But, we use a lot of glutamine, we use a lot of fish oil, we use a lot of probiotics. Again, I don't think you have to go heavy-handed necessarily on the probiotics when you're using herbs because they are plants. And again, they just don't have that same level of die-off that you get with antibiotics. But I still think it's important to help, protect the gut. So most people are taking probiotics, all the things, digestive enzymes and things to help support good, healthy digestion and elimination. So, once we know that's squared away, then we can kind of jump into, using the different herbs.
And are there things that you can use, herbal or otherwise, that help? You mentioned, that the Lyme can get in a dormant state. Are there things that you can do to bring it out of its dormant state in order to treat it?
Well, the nice thing about herbs is you don't necessarily have to do that. We know from the research in herbs that the herbs actually kill Lyme in their dormant state. So, I think where the challenge comes, and again, this is very hard to measure. I'm not aware of any research looking at this. With Lyme can get inside a cell, drugs sometimes have a hard time getting inside the cell. Antibiotics certainly do. So there's always a question about if the organism is inside a cell, inside tissue, how effective are we going to be at treating it? We don't have a practical way to measure it. And it kind of comes back a little bit to the testing. We don't really have good testing that measures Lyme directly in the body. We look at the immune response. We can look at Babesia under a microscope because it's a red blood cell parasite. I can put your red blood cells under a microscope and look for it. Bartonella and other things we can do, other types of testing that more directly looks at the organism. But to date, we don't really have a good test that looks at Lyme directly. So, we've got to do these other fundamental things to help improve gut health, help support the immune system, make it easier so your body can manage this. But even when they're using herbs, because of the slow growing nature of Lyme, it's not uncommon that people are in treatment for several months, sometimes even up to several years. I tell my patients it can be anywhere from 6 to 18 months to, potentially get through the whole process. Hopefully it goes faster. I had one patient who came to see me from Arizona who had very severe neurological Lyme. In my head, I'm thinking, boy, this is going to take her a while. And I did all the things with her diet and her gut health and put her on, Chinese herbs. She came back a month later and all her symptoms were 100% gone. I followed her for many years afterwards. She never had a relapse. So it was kind of a one and done thing, which I would, this is the asterisk where, results not typical, but a while we hit the nail on the head and you're like, wow, that was great. I wish everybody responded this way.
I know that just is so hard. And, in clinical practice, I've had those patients as well, where you're thinking, oh my God, this is going to be so impossible. I don't know how I'm going to do this. And they come back just like that. And then you have these people that you're thinking, oh, I've seen this 10,000 times. It's going to be so easy. I'm just going to Candida, give you some diflucan, you're done. And it's just, not working. So it's always interesting to have those patients. So do you do any adjunct treatments such as maybe infrared sauna, hyperbarics, IV ozone, anything else that you do?
We do a lot of different things, and we do a lot of immunotherapy in our practice. So, we know that Lyme has the capacity to trigger this really autoimmune effect. And it's not autoimmune in the way that we think about, like with lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. There's no blood test that measures that, but we know from the research that this autoimmune reaction can target the gray matter, the white matter of the brain, can target your peripheral nerves, can target your joints. So a lot of the symptoms that people are experiencing, they think it's the infection directly, like the organisms burrowed in your brain, and it doesn't really do that. It's really this autoimmune reaction that affects the brain, and there's probably some degree of mast cell activation as well that's affecting the different tissues, and microbes can be triggers for mast cell activation. So often we're doing some type of immunotherapy to downregulate that immune response to the organism. Or, sometimes I find people, tell me that, they never had a food reaction. They never were sensitive to mold, pollen. After they get exposed to Lyme, now their whole world bothers them. So even if we're successful at eradicating Lyme, we still have to go back and treat the immune system. So sometimes we got to deal with the food allergies, the pollen allergies, the mold allergies, and so forth. But I like therapies like hyperbaric oxygen. It's a great anti-inflammatory, non-invasive, safe way to deal with a lot of these things that Lyme can cause. I'm a huge fan of sauna. Infrared sauna is a great way to detoxify. And I think, again, most people that have chronic illness have some element of toxicity, which is what leads to the chronic illness. So we know from Dr. Stephen Genuis, who did a lot of research on sauna, through the sweat, you excrete mycotoxins, heavy metals, pesticides, herbicides. Really, you get rid of a lot of junk. So if there's ways that we can help people that don't necessarily involve taking a pill, that's great. We do IVs in our practice as well. So if people need extra nutritional support, IV vitamin C, glutathione. I'm not a huge fan for IV ozone for Lyme. My experience with it is that it's a temporary relief for most people. It tends to be very expensive. I don't think I've ever seen anyone that did IV ozone and felt like it cured them. So for the cost benefit ratio, that's lower on my list. But there's so many other different things, really kind of depending on the individual, that we can utilize. I'm also a big fan of ion cleanse foot baths. I was very skeptical when I first learned about it. And then we did a little study in our office and found that after doing the foot bath, the bath water itself had high levels of lead and mercury. It showed it was mobilizing metals out of tissue.
Really? Because those things get such a bad rap. I wasn't sure that they were truly effective.
Well, when I first learned about it, and I used to see them at all these conferences, and you see this change in the water, and they're like, oh, if it's green, you mean this. If it's brown, it made no biological sense. And the color of the water truly has nothing to do with anything. It's just the chemistry between your skin and ions in the bath. And that's all it is. But, the fact that we did a foot bath with no feet in the water. We measured the water before and after. I did it. The other doctor in our practice did it. And in both of our foot baths, after the treatment, there were significantly higher levels of lead and mercury in both of ours. So at least for metals, it does seem to mobilize it. And I've had several patients over the years use it and report that they had clinical benefit. So again, I understand why people are skeptical. I was skeptical for years. It took me a long time to come to actually even talk to them about it. But again, anything I think that's going to help improve your detox pathways. We do a lot with different homeopathics, drainage remedies to try and help open up your kidneys and your liver and your lymphatics and your skin and all of that. So, it's really not a one way of approaching it. We really have to look at the individual and again, find the right tools that works within your budget, within your lifestyle, things that you can actually do so that we can get people moving forward.
And you mentioned immunotherapy. Is that the LDA and the LDI, or is that something else? And can you explain what those are?
There's different types of immunotherapy. And for people who are unfamiliar with that term, if you think about allergy shots are a type of immunotherapy. So if you're allergic to dust or ragweed, you go to the allergist every week. They inject you with dust and ragweed. And then over time, it builds your immune tolerance to dust and ragweed. So hopefully you can be around these things and that doesn't make you sneeze and itch and cough and so forth. So we do really 3 different types of immunotherapy. One's called sublingual immunotherapy. Sublingual means under the tongue. It's very similar to allergy shots. We just don't inject it. We just put the drops under the tongue. So this is very effective for people that've got different food sensitivities, mold, pollen, cat, dust, dog, feathers. We treat people for chemical sensitivity and things of that nature. It's been around for 100 years. There's over 1,000 studies. It's widely used throughout Europe. It's actually preferable over allergy shots because it's a lot cheaper. But allergists in this country only get reimbursed for doing the shots. They don't get reimbursed for doing drops under the tongue. So that's not favorable with them. But again, it can be very effective for desensitizing people against that. LDA is low dose allergy therapy. It was developed in the 1960s by an ENT surgeon in the UK. It used to be called EPD, which was enzyme potentiated desensitization. And basically, this doctor figured out if you take these allergy extracts, dilute them far beyond what allergists were using at the time and even now, and then mixing with an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, it actually helps modulate your immune system to whatever you've mixed it with. So again, if you mix it with pollen, you mix it with mold, you mix it with food. And so it's another way to try and help desensitize people against whatever it is in their world that bothers them. The nice thing about LDA is that it's super dilute. Way more than any other type of immunotherapy. So it's very safe for anybody, children, older people, people that have cancer, people that have other, health conditions. And again, it can be a way to help restore immune tolerance. And then the third one is LDI or low dose immunotherapy. I know all these acronyms and names, they all kind of sound the same, but LDI really is a way of desensitizing people against microbes. So if your body starts treating Lyme or strep or candida as an allergen and not a pathogen, it engages a completely different part of your immune system that can cause an autoimmune reaction to different tissue. So for example, we know that strep can cause rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease. Every doctor in the world knows this is an autoimmune reaction to the strep organism. So in theory, LDI could be a way to try and turn that reaction off versus just giving somebody antibiotics to try and wipe out strep the rest of their life. We found that, if you go into the medical literature and you type in any condition and you put the words and molecular mimicry, it'll bring up all these research articles on different conditions and what microbe is potentially an autoimmune trigger. We know that Lyme disease can cause, arthritis. It can cause hypothyroidism. It can cause MS and other brain symptoms. We know that interstitial cystitis has a very strong association with the allergic reaction to candida. And in my practice, I think I'm almost 100% on treating interstitial cystitis by desensitizing mostly women to candida. So a lot of times, we get the sense that there's an overgrowth or an overabundance of certain microbes. And when you take an antifungal or an antibiotic, your symptoms get better. So the assumptions that I've killed off the organism, I'm like, well, that's probably true to an extent. It's also that if you've got 1 million organisms and you bring it down to 1,000, there's now less stuff to irritate your immune system. So that immune reaction is going to drop as well. So for people who've been through repeated courses of, SIBO treatment and yeast treatment and, whatever it is, when it keeps coming back over and over, that's kind of a red flag for me that maybe it's really not overgrowth. Maybe it really is an autoimmune reaction to that microbe. And that's where we would use something like LDI.
And I'm going to give you a personal plug here that I and my family have done both the enzymes and LDA and LDI. Elle had Well, first of all, let me back up. I mean, you're triple board certified in pediatrics, environmental medicine, and internal medicine. So you are one of the smartest people I know, and you are on speed dial, particularly in the very early years of Elle's life. I was able to keep her off antibiotics until we all got COVID and then all needed a Z-Pack. But prior to that, no antibiotics. So she was 6 before she ever had any antibiotics. And
Yay.
yay. So she had horrible eczema when she was born and a suppressed IgA. And of course, I did all the things on my end, getting her off gluten and dairy and fixing her gut and treating her candida and all of those things. But she had a lot of reactions to all kinds of foods, such as oranges. And, here she was in Montessori school, and part of their work was to peel clementines. It was this hand-eye, stuff, but she couldn't do it because of her allergies. So I sought you out, and we did a lot of the LDA and enzymes for her. And, between my work and your work, all of her eczema has been gone for years now, and she's able to eat clementines. So I never recommend, of course, that people go back to gluten or dairy, but you also helped me with, I think, because eating a paleo lifestyle, I was eating a lot of coconut, I was eating a lot of avocados, and I could tell that I was not doing great with them. And, after several months of working with you and doing the drops, able to eat coconuts and avocados with no problem now. So
Awesome. Well, that's the goal.
yeah, definitely encourage people to seek you out, even if they're not, dealing with Lyme disease. You work on the full spectrum of conditions, chronic conditions. So, well, I know in my practice, once I was alerted to Lyme, that I saw a lot of people that had both mold toxicity, toxic molds, exposure, and Lyme. And then, of course, I saw people who had individuals. So there's a lot of overlap in symptoms. So I guess my first question to you is, how do you distinguish, is it mold, is it Lyme? And then, what are you doing when you see this? I don't want to call it a co-infection, but, exposure to both.
Yeah, it's really tricky. When you look at the symptoms of mycotoxin or mold illness and Lyme disease, there's an 85% overlap of symptoms that can be very difficult. And I think, it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing. I've talked with Dr. Neil Nathan, who's a mold guy several times, and we very friendly, I think, disagree with each other on approach. And again, it's not a right or wrong, and I know in his world, he always wants to deal with mold first. Deal with mold first, and then whatever's left over, okay, that's probably Lyme. But in my practice, I see people who are affected by both. They have Lyme disease, they live in a moldy environment, but clinically, it's very difficult to distinguish what symptoms might be related to mold versus Lyme. The one thing that I think stands out, like migratory joint pain or joint pain as a whole, that's not really a big mold symptom. That tends to be much more associated with Lyme disease. But a lot of the neurological symptoms, the brain fog, the fatigue, neuropathy, weird skin stuff, that can happen with mold as well. So I don't know that any of us out there can really tell people with any certainty how much of their symptoms are specifically related to mold, which one's related to Lyme. Again, I've heard some doctors who want to deal with the Lyme first, other doctors want to deal with mold first. In our practice, we deal with both. And it doesn't mean you necessarily have to start this whole huge treatment regimen at the same time. But I've also had the experience of, not dealing with it right away. When I first started, I was really more Lyme focused, wasn't thinking about mold as much. And then realized after a handful of years that, we started Lyme treatment, people got a little better, but they still weren't where we wanted them to be. And then once we tested them for mold, found out they had mold illness and started that took them to the next level. I'm like, God, why didn't I do that right from the get-go? We could have saved somebody a lot of time. And I know how it is. I'm a patient too. I deal with an autoimmune disease, and I'm as impatient as anyone else and wanting to get better. So in my mind, it didn't seem fair to people to not address the problem. And so often, when we're meeting for the first time, it's kind of, I almost test every new patient, at least that I'm suspicious of, for these kind of symptoms, let's test for tick-borne illness. Let's test for mold together. Let's see what's there so we know what we're dealing with. And then we can figure out what the best, treatment approach is. But to say that one's better or worse than the other, and they say, well, mold suppresses the immune system. Yeah, we know what Lyme can suppress the immune system. It all suppresses the immune system. So at the end of the day, I don't know that it's better to try and deal with one and then the other if you're dealing with both. So again, I think we figured out a way to layer it in where, we start people on treatment and then we add in things as we feel like they need it, depending on how they're responding. And really, it's just about fine tuning it over the course of treatment to, again, find that right combination of things that works well for you. But because, again, so many of these foundational things, like we talked about, diet and gut health and detoxification, whether it's mold illness or Lyme, you're going to want to do that anyway to help improve your health.
Right. One of the things that I found was also in distinguishing the two was, as you mentioned, the life cycle of Lyme and it being sort of cyclical. Assuming the person is not changing their environment, which could, of course, contribute to having symptoms one day and not. If they're in this consistent environment, but then their symptoms seem to wax and wane, that also made me think Lyme was either involved or that it was Lyme over toxic mold. And then I would agree with you, right? We have those patients who can really only handle one thing at a time. And we have the other patients, which is how I am. It's like, throw it all on me. I want to deal with it as quickly as possible. And so, you have those people who can both physically and mentally only handle one thing at a time. And then you have the patients who can, physically and mentally handle many things at one time. And I think the only caveat I would say to that is if they're currently in the moldy environment, is getting them out of that environment. Because if you're trying to treat while they're still living or working, in that environment, it's very difficult, in my experience, to make a lot of progress.
Absolutely. If you're living in toxic soup, again, whether it's Lyme or mold illness, it's very hard to make progress. And again, I unfortunately learned the hard way as a doctor that, when people are going through these things and they still feel really sick. And I'm like, now, did you test your house for mold? Well, I looked around, I didn't see anything. Well, okay, that's not really testing your house for mold. You've got to do at least an ERMI, if not get a professional in. And I'm sure you've had a similar experience in your practice. The number of people that were convinced there's no possible way that you could have mold. Now, you lived in Texas for many years where, you get a lot of humidity. We don't really have that issue in California, but in California, we have terrible construction. And so, they throw up these tract homes very quickly. Somebody didn't fit a pipe correctly in the bathroom or the kitchen. And so most of the mold's coming from something within the home itself, just from bad plumbing. And of course, we've had so much rain so far this winter and last winter, when it rains here, everything leaks like a sieve. So poor construction is a common cause. But, if you're ever suspicious at all, don't hesitate to spend the money to get good quality testing done, because like you said, if you're living in a toxic environment, it's going to be very hard for the treatment to be successful.
I sort of equate seeing mold to seeing the bullseye rash. The number of patients that actually told me, or even once they had a mold inspector that could actually physically, visibly see the mold, very rare. I mean, I'm like, if you are physically, open up your sheetrock and you see mold, like, wow, you've got a problem. Because 90-something% of the people, that I have worked with, and myself included with my mold exposures, there's no visible mold. But that doesn't mean that mold's not there. It's a microscopic organism that, until there's a extreme levels, you're not going to see it with the naked eye.
Absolutely. And, even if you had water intrusion that happened a while ago and they said, well, it dried out, it's fine. I'm like, well, no, you can still get mold growth from that previous exposure. So yeah, it's complicated. And again, unfortunately, it can be very expensive, to get good testing. And of course, if you do have a mold problem, I mean, I have a patient I'm working with where a 6-year-old little girl would just break out in hives. And we figured out finally that it was mold in their house. They were living at, now 4 years old, but at the time it was 3-year-old house. They'd already spent $100,000 remediating their house. They had 3 separate water intrusions. And of course, insurance usually doesn't pay for any of this. But every time she, got out of the moldy environment, went on vacation, her hives would get better. And once they did the remediation, her hives went away. And then the family went on vacation to Hawaii and stayed at some moldy place. And she broke out in hives within minutes of being in the hotel they were in. And as soon as they got back, her hives completely went away. So in some weird way, her skin's become a great barometer when there is mold around. But I think it's just a good illustration of how, mold can be so pervasive and really cause a lot of health problems.
And yeah, I mean, for better or worse, she's lucky that her skin is telling her. Mine does too. I mean, I'm so sensitive. I've had patients come into my practice and I can literally feel it on them. I was at a friend's house who I didn't know where she had any water intrusion. In fact, she wasn't aware of any, and apparently said, it's there. And then she opened up her house and that's where it was. So for better or worse, I definitely will be doing a few podcasts with myself and some other experts on mold because, yes, I definitely have experienced it myself and also moldy hotel room, more than moldy, but, very extreme. So, well, anything that you feel that we haven't covered regarding Lyme, anything that you want to cover here at the end about Lyme?
Well, I think what I want to leave people with who are tuning in is that, if you've had this kind of odd collection of symptoms, again, particularly if they involve your brain, your joints, and you're not getting answers, please find a practitioner who's willing to go down that rabbit hole with you. I've just seen people who've gone on years suffering needlessly because they had a doctor that didn't believe in Lyme, said, we live in Texas, there is no Lyme. Even in California, I had a doctor tell a patient, not only they told him there's no Lyme disease in California, even though the CDC says California is the 5th fastest growing state for Lyme in the country. They also told the patient there's no deer in California. I'm like, we have deer crossing signs everywhere. I'm like, you need to get out more. But this is kind of what we're up against. We're up against a system that doesn't, unfortunately, kind of buy into this, despite all the mountains of research suggesting otherwise. So sometimes you have to be your own best advocate and, find, a naturopathic doctor, functional medicine doctor, someone who's going to walk that path with you.
And I like to end our podcast, the Take Back Your Health podcast, with 3 things that our listeners can do today to take back their health.
So I think number 1, be very mindful of your food. I mean, diet is everything. What you put in your mouth dictates how much fuel is available for your body, how your microbiome and its diversity are going to modify itself. So be very conscious. Think of food as either healing your body or harming your body. And it's not to say we don't have times of enjoyment, but as a whole, be very mindful about food. Number 2 is, I think, be mindful about your sleep. I think people underestimate how important your sleep is because that's when your body does all that great work. That a lot of that healing happens when you're in that deep restorative sleep. And I think modern culture with electronics and our lifestyles, we're up late, we're on our phones, our iPads, and it really takes away from having good quality sleep. Yet that little change can be huge. And I think number 3 is find that one thing every day that brings joy to your life. I think the last few years during the pandemic have been so stressful that we've forgotten how to have fun. And if you've been sick and you feel terrible, it's easy to forget about the things that maybe you did when you were younger, even as a kid, that brought joy to your life. But I think it's important to have that connection so that, you can still be human and just take, even if it's for a few minutes, whether it's music, a funny movie, art, whatever it is for you that sparks a little bit of joy. I think that's good for our mental well-being.
This has been great to catch up with you and a wonderful interview, very informative about Lyme. Can you let people know where they can find you, both on social media, but also if anybody's interested in becoming a patient?
Sure. Easiest place is just on my website. It's just DarinIngelsND.com, and that's my handle for all my social media platform.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Darin Ingels. Great to see you, and thanks for the interview.
Great. Thank you so much.
I want to thank this week's guests for sharing their time and knowledge, and thank you for listening. To read the full show notes for each episode, which include a summary, timestamp, quotes, and any resources mentioned, please visit amymyersmd.com. podcast. Lastly, if you've enjoyed this episode, I'd love if you would leave a rating and a review on Apple or Spotify, and we'll select a few to read out loud in a future episode. Tune in next week to hear from another inspiring guest as we help you take back your health.